stranger, let's break this thing open. And distance is danger, so I'll pull you close and
see no monster, we all come here broken, but love can't unbreak us if it goes unspoken.
See no stranger, not saying I'm a savior, but I'm here to show you that open is braver. See no monster, cause monsters are fiction. Real people are messy, and so is forgiveness. Each act of forgiveness is such tricky business. Let me hear your story, and I'll be your witness.
Let me be your sister, let me be your brother. Let me see you now
with the eyes of a mother. La 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 la. No monster, just more learned behavior. Under his thick skin is something so tender. See no stranger, no typecast, no token.
See all people as people in motion.
There are no monsters, there are no strangers. That's just a shedding of armor.
Each act of forgiveness is such tricky business. Let me hear your story, and I'll be your witness.
Let me be your sister, let me be your brother. Let me see you now with the eyes of a mother. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La la la.
So good evening, everyone. This is the 19th annual Pat Reif Memorial Lecture, and my name is Janice Poss, and I'm the Senior Coordinator for the lecture series. And I want to welcome everybody here at Claremont Graduate University, and I'm so glad to have you here this evening. Before I turn this over to our introductory panelists and committee members, I want to let you all know that you can communicate only through the chat feature, which is on the bottom of your screen. You'll see chat, and you just click on it and write in any questions or any communications to anyone who might be attending this evening. We'll have time for a Q&A at the end of Valarie's talk, and if you can put your questions and your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the lecture. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to the Dean of the School of the Arts and Humanities, Dr. Laurie Farrell. Laurie, the floor is yours.
But not for long. This is a small screen that I'm looking in from my house, but I feel like I see no strangers here. 3 years ago, I became dean, and I talked to all of you in a wonderful room with everybody sharing space. We still are. And CGU is very, very proud and happy to be host of this 19th annual Pat Reif Memorial Lecture. I want to thank everybody that has had something to do with this, especially the tireless Pat Reif committee, who always astonish me at their capacity for hard work and enthusiasm. I want to thank you, Janice, for getting this all ready for us. And mostly I want to thank Valarie Kaur for being with us this evening. I know that this is going to be another memorable evening, and all I can say is that I'm just so glad that CGU is a part of it. Welcome, everybody. and we're all here together. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Laurie Ann. And our partner for this lecture is Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles. And we have many students with us here this evening. So what I'd like to do is welcome their president, Dr. Ann McElhinney Johnson, who will say a few words to us and to the students at MSMU. Ann?
Thank you so much. Good evening. It's my pleasure on behalf of Mount St. Mary's University to welcome you to the Pat Reif Memorial Lecture Series. As was said, the series was established years ago, 2002, to honor Pat Reif as a feminist scholar and activist who worked to change lives and systems. For true justice requires both. Mount St. Mary's is so proud and grateful to host this series, and is co-sponsored by our Religious Studies Department, Claremont Graduate University, and the Immaculate Heart community. I want to offer a special thank you as we begin this evening to Mount St. Mary's Dr. Laurie for her leadership in bringing these incredibly gifted speakers to our communities. We're very excited tonight to hear from our speaker, an esteemed speaker, activist, scholar, civil rights attorney, and educator, Valarie Kaur, who will speak to us about the radical and oh so needed concept of revolutionary love, a concept that is so reflective of the mission of our founders, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. We're very honored to have her with us tonight. And Ms. Kaur, we thank you for joining us and for sharing how the transformative power of love can change not only our own lives, but the fragile world in which we live. So welcome, and it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight.
Thank you very much, Ann. So now what I'd like to do is introduce Reverend Ann Heyman, who was a student of Pat's at the Immaculate Heart College, and she's going to tell us a little bit about Pat and how this lecture series came to be. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Janice. There's really no way to say just a little bit about Pat. She was indeed a woman before her time and a remarkable person, and she certainly understood a revolutionary love. She started the program, the feminist spirituality program, in the early 1980s, and I had just started a ministry with street prostitutes here in Los Angeles at the time, and was looking for another program, looking for better, more information, certainly things that my seminary had not taught me. And but my friend Bear Ride said, you know, Pat Reif over at Immaculate Heart is going to start a program in feminist spirituality, and I think we need to check it out. So we did. We enrolled, and it became a life-changing encounter, not only to study with Pat, but to sit at the feet of Rosemary Radford Ruther and Mary Hunt and Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. It doesn't get any better than that. And certainly being exposed to the world of feminist spirituality, feminist theology was salvific for, I think, everyone who ever enrolled in the program. Pat had to kind of kick me out. After 10 years, she actually made me graduate, which was, I guess, okay. I was ready by then, I think. But it was a wonderful experience, and Pat had just a remarkable ability to run a program that indeed met so many needs.
Thank you so much, Ann. And now what I'd like to do is introduce Stephanie Glatt, who is an IHM and was a dear friend of Pat's for many years. And she'll share briefly about her friendship with Pat and introduce the video that tells us a little bit more about Pat and her career.
Thank you, Janice. We'll try briefly. Actually, my life intersected with Pat's for over 50 years. That's why it's hard to do it briefly. I first knew her, though, as an academic. She was Sister Richard, a sister of the Immaculate Heart. She was my teacher from high school Latin and religion, through college philosophy and ethics, through a master's degree in feminist spirituality. She was an excellent educator. We, her students, were in awe of her knowledge and her ability to present material in a way that we could grasp. We couldn't help learning from her. So we knew that Pat had found her calling in life. But then, in 1975, Pat attended a lecture on women and religion by author, activist, and feminist Anne McGrew Bennett here at Claremont. Pat could tell you the exact time and the date and how she experienced almost a religious conversion during that talk. It suddenly became clear to her that how things were in the world was not just fate or the will of God. It was the result of a hierarchical system that supported racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, dogmatism, and was responsible for the gradual destruction of the natural world. That night, Pat became an activist. The born-again Pat Reif devoted the rest of her life to the elimination of the patriarchal system. She knew that meaningful activism had to grow out of knowledge. So using her academic background, she created the first master's program in feminist spirituality in the United States. She chose activist scholars from across the world to be our teachers. This annual lecture in Pat's honor continues her tradition. We are now going to see a short video about Pat. The setting is the grounds of La Casa de Maria Retreat Center in Santa Barbara, which is owned by the Immaculate Heart community. In the early days, these beautiful grounds also served as the novitiate for the sisters. You'll see the oak trees, the labyrinth, and most of all, the beautiful stone house built in the 1920s, where Pat and I received our spiritual training. This was and is a sacred place, and I'm so happy to be able to share it with you as you become acquainted with Pat Reif. Thank you. I can see Pat walking around here. There's many oak trees here. Some of them have been here for hundreds of years, and they're strong and they survive almost anything. And I think of Pat, you know, and her strength. I think of her love for the environment, her wanting to have the whole universe healthy. And I think it's a great symbol for Pat, because I think of her big heart and her holding everybody, holding the universe, holding all people, holding animals. And this house has held everybody. My friend Pat Reif was a nun, as I was. She went to St. Louis University, and she also did some work at Oxford. And that's because she was also going to be teaching at Immaculate Heart College.
Here at home, a group of nuns decided recently that they would break with the Vatican altogether, but would continue much of the work they had been doing. ABC's Dick Shoemaker has a report from Los Angeles.
The 500 sisters own and operate a Catholic girls' college near Hollywood and Vine. In 1967, the sisters started a minor rebellion. They decided it was time to discard the traditional black habit. It was time, they said, to set their own lifestyles, to pray and work where and when they wanted.
There were 600 sisters at the peak of the order, no longer connected as a canonical institute to Rome.
I think for the Immaculate Heart community, we had taken a bold step, and that seems like a really feminist thing to do. We weren't bowing to male hierarchical dominance. We were standing up against it. Then what happened is, as Pat became more and more a feminist, she educated the community.
Pat created the feminist spirituality program at a time when this scholarship was just budding. It was just beginning.
She had wide contact with theologians and philosophers, so she was able to staffed the program with eminent scholars throughout those years.
It was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. She set it up on the weekends. She brought in feminist theologians who could address those particular topics. So it didn't matter whether it was economics or immigration or mental illness or addictions or violence against women. She wasn't afraid of any of that stuff.
Her early understanding of the importance of religion as part of feminist studies in general, what's now sometimes called gender studies, but she really understood that religion couldn't be left out of that, and that to leave it out was to leave out a real factor, kind of an engine, if you will, for discrimination and for oppression that could in fact be turned around, as the great theologian Dan McGuire says, with its renewable moral energy.
I was arrested with her. We were part of the group called U.S. Out of El Salvador, and we did a resistance, civil disobedience downtown in front of the federal building. Yes, right here in Los Angeles. So there must have been about 60 or 70, maybe 80 of us. And when you go to jail like that, you're all put in the same room. And so you really get to know people, waiting to see what's going to happen.
Pat says, as we're walking outside after that little jury trial, she said, "So, how do you feel about being guilty?" And so people are saying, "Well, I don't feel guilty," and blah, blah, blah. And she engaged us in a conversation about that. And she said, "Well, there's alternative language for that, don't you?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Some people would call it being faithful. I do."
When she suddenly got ill, she was also in Claremont and was even closer, and there was more chance to speak with her. And it went really fast. And so when she died, all of us had this powerful feeling that her presence needed to continue.
The IHM women that I coordinate this lecture series with have been wonderful to know. And just knowing more about Pat Reif, the more I know about her, the more I am just enamored of who she was as a person, as an activist, because she took chances and she took risks.
How do we honor Pat Reif's legacy? So the way for us to do that, again, is to think hard on what was important to her, to bring forward issues in social activism, social justice, to think about issues around women's spirituality, about sometimes resistance to women's movements, women's activism, women's spirituality even, and to see how these issues are still active and live. So this is very much what we try to do as a program. And the lecture itself is a way to kind of to bring that moment into focus.
Back in January, there was a huge mud and debris slide. Huge boulders and mud came down the mountain, and it destroyed 9 of our buildings. And it surrounded this house with mud, but it didn't come into the house. It had a spiritual strength. Somebody said to the mud and the boulders, "You can go somewhere else, but don't come here." And they didn't. And I feel like that's kind of the kind of strength Pat had. Somebody could do something somewhere else, but not where she was.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So And I just want to take this moment. Sorry, I'm having a little technical snafu. I just want to now introduce Dr. Nicola Denzi Lewis, who is our professor of religion and Margot L. Goldsmith's chair of women's studies and religion at CGU. And she will introduce our speaker for this evening. Nicola.
Good evening, everyone. As Janice said, I'm Nicola Denzi Lewis. I hold the Margot L. Goldsmith Chair in Women's Studies and Religion here at Claremont Graduate University, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the main event tonight. Valarie Kaur is an activist, lawyer, educator, author, filmmaker, spiritual leader, spouse, and mother of two. Trained at Stanford, Harvard, and Yale, Valarie's a third-generation Sikh American and our first Sikh Pat Reif lecturer, and I have a feeling that she and Pat Reif would have gotten along splendidly. Let me share a brief story about how Valarie came to be here tonight. Years ago, when I arrived at CGU, I began to search for some Pat Reif Memorial lecturers. I aim high. I wanted to invite the best, most inspiring, and influential women faith leaders in the United States today. My research led me to an article from the Center for American Progress on the most promising progressive faith leaders. Here's what they had to say about Valarie Kaur. She is a standout figure in the world of interfaith organizing and activism. They praise her work helping to lead campaigns for racial dignity, religious pluralism, immigrant rights, prison reform, and gay, transgender, and gender equality, ultimately naming her as at the forefront of progressive change. I knew that she was our woman, but it's taken some time for all the pieces to come together, and so I'm absolutely thrilled that this year they have, made more possible by the magic of Zoom, which brings her here to us tonight from New York City. Let me give you just a few highlights of her stellar achievements towards social justice. An award-winning documentary film, Divided We Fall, Americans in the Aftermath, about hate crimes against people of color in the wake of 9/11, after a family friend, Balbir Singh Sodhi, became the first Sikh person to be killed in a hate crime after 9/11. She's the founder of Groundswell Movement, considered America's largest multi-faith online organizing network, recognized for dynamically strengthening faith-based organizing in the 21st century. She's a co-founder of the Faithful Internet, which organizes people of faith to protect net neutrality. She's the founder of the Yale Visual Law Project. She's the author of See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love, which grew from her TED Talk that had been seen by over 4 million people. And this book is now the 2021 Dayton Literary Peace Prize finalist. And most famously, she's the founder of the Revolutionary Love Project, about which I hope we will learn more tonight. Valarie has spoken at the Pentagon, at the White House, and lastly, to us here tonight. And I'm so pleased and excited to welcome Valarie back, if only virtually, to her native California, and I can't wait to hear her inspire us this evening.
Oh, Nicola, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It is such an honor for me to be here with you all tonight. I want to take a moment to honor the ancestors of the land beneath our feet. The Tongva people in Los Angeles, the Lenape people here in New York City, their wisdom, past, present, and future. And as we sense the earth beneath us, I invite you now to imagine all the ancestors who've come before us. And if you would, choose one ancestor who, when you think of them, makes you feel brave. It could be someone from your family line or someone from recent history, but you can close your eyes for a moment and just place your hand on your heart and imagine them standing behind you now. Good. From this place, I invite you to take a deep breath with me. Let it come and let it go. And now imagining all of the ancestors we've called upon helping us turn this virtual space into a sacred space. As you open your eyes again and return to the screen, if you had someone who came to you, someone who you want to hold in your heart this evening, I invite you to put their name in the chat, but don't hit enter just yet. Go ahead and write their name. Good, and on the count of 3, we're going to press enter. 1, 2, 3. We are holding in our hearts tonight Josephine and Olivia and Francis. We are holding in our hearts Lorraine and Margaret and Esther. We're holding in our hearts Victoria and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Lillian and Jenny and Andrew and Stella and Eleanor. We're holding in our hearts Marie, Martin, Karen, and yes, we are holding in our hearts Pat Reif. I am holding in my heart Pat Reif. I have been so moved to have been introduced to her through the women, their memories that you have just heard and experienced, and through reading about her and learning about her life story. She is a recent ancestor. And in learning about her life, I have felt so inspired. And so as I begin my talk tonight, I want to take a few moments to sink into her memory together. Are you ready? I see her as a young nun in full habit, studying texts, mind sparkling, and then listening to that one momentous lecture, feeling a stirring inside of her, knowing that theology and action, spirituality and social justice are not separate spheres, but fused within her as a calling to live a whole life. I see her sitting with her sisters in the long hours, encouraging them to follow their hearts until hundreds followed her lead, breaking with the Roman Catholic Church to create a new space where women could thrive fully and where all were welcome. And I can only imagine the audacity and the courage it took to give rise to the Immaculate Heart community. I see her reading on the lawn on October 18th, 1975, to be specific, almost exactly 46 years ago, pausing from the page and realizing all at once that it was time to call herself a feminist. And that to be a feminist meant seeing women as human beings with every capacity to teach and govern and think and speak. I see her building the program in feminist spirituality and infusing women's studies and religion at Claremont with this conviction of dignity for all. I see her in the streets of Los Angeles, the city I call my home, putting that conviction into action. She is at the steps of the federal building downtown or at an intersection in El Segundo protesting war and nuclear weapons, military aggression. And when arrested, she turns the jail cell into a classroom and holds a mini seminar on justice and solidarity so that when the women are taken away, they are in handcuffs, but they are holding hands as sisters. That's what she did. Pat Reif built beloved community around her, in her classroom, in halls of power, in the streets. And whether she was organizing farmers markets to accept food stamps or bringing feminist theologians from around the world to speak to her students, she did these things with passion and what I call a revolutionary kind of love. I was especially moved to learn that when she got sick, she prepared her own funeral, bringing her sisters together to sing the songs she selected, and she sang with them. not long after, at her funeral, as they sang these songs, I can only imagine that they must have heard her singing along too. Isn't that the true measure of one's impact on the world? To be faithful to the labor, to be so faithful that your song goes on after you, to be so faithful that your love outlasts your life. For these reasons, I am deeply moved to deliver my remarks tonight in her name and in her memory. And as I do so, may I join to my song to hers and to yours and into all of these ancestors you have invoked to be with us tonight. So I am going to speak to you tonight on what I call revolutionary love. I will begin with a story of how I first heard the call to love. And then I want to talk about the challenges that we are facing as a society and why I believe revolutionary love is the call of our times. And then we'll get into the how. The question of how do we put it into practice? I can think of no better way to honor Pat than to offer to put a practical tool, a compass, in your hands. Are you ready? Okay. So I begin with my own story. I grew up on the farmlands of California, just 3.5 hours north of Los Angeles, Fresno, Clovis. I grew up on the land that my family had lived and farmed on for almost a century. I grew up riding tractors and running through the peach orchards and talking to the stars at night as if they were my friends. And I grew up with the stories of my ancestors. You see, my grandfather sailed by steamship from India to America in the year 1913. And when he landed at Angel Island, immigration officials took one look at his turban and beard and threw him behind bars. You see, Ellis Island on the East Coast was a beacon of welcome for European immigrants, but Angel Island on the West Coast was a station designed to detain, deport as many Asian immigrants as possible. And so my grandfather was one of many who were incarcerated for months on end. Oh, Janice, you can just take down that slide. Because, yeah, thank you, my love. He was incarcerated for months on end, and he would have been deported. I would not be here with you today if it weren't for the intervention of one man, a Christian man, a lawyer named Henry Marshall, who filed a writ of habeas corpus that helped free my grandfather on Christmas Eve of 1913. It was as if that lawyer chose to see my grandfather not as a foreigner or as a suspect, but as a brother. I have to think that that single act of solidarity stayed with my grandfather, for he spent years working his way down California, sleeping in barns, sleeping inside of grape crates, twisting his body to fit inside them to keep himself safe from the snakes, working for pennies a day. And this was the life of a farm laborer. And yet, decades later, when he saw his own Japanese American neighbors rounded up and incarcerated in their own camps in the Midwest during World War II, my grandfather was one of the few who went to visit them when it was dangerous to do so. He looked after their farms so that they would have a life to return to when they finally came home, those that did come home. The granddaughter of these elder Japanese Americans became my best friend at school. Her name was Bryn Saito. And in the wake of 9/11, when it was my family who was now seen as the nation's new enemy, Bryn threw her blanket over my shoulders, fed me soup after the latest hate crime as I was shaking from the latest mass shooting. And fast forward in the last year during this pandemic, when it's Bryn and her family who are now afraid to walk outside of their home for fear, not of COVID, but for another racial attack, it is I who comfort her in the dark hours at the night on the telephone. She calls it Ancestral Solidarity, for us to remember what our ancestors did for one another. For they taught us not only how to be American, they taught us how to love in the face of oppression. It was a revolutionary kind of love. So these stories were stories I grew up with, that despite our nation's history, a history that was founded in the blood of white supremacy through colonization and slavery, despite these things, there were still stories of people who saw one another as brothers and sisters and siblings, took one another's arms and grieved together and raged together and decided to rise up to follow their own vision of what America could be, a land of dignity for all. So I first heard the call to love in these stories. That's not the only place I heard it as a little girl. When I came home from school crying from hearing another racial slur, the first one was 6 years old, and it was, "Get up, you black dog." I remember going to my grandfather, my mother's father, who lived with us, and he would scoop me up in his arms and wipe my tears and tell me the stories of my Sikh ancestors in our faith tradition. Stories of warriors and saints and sages and poets, a history that went on long before my family ever arrived on US soil. And in that history, I heard this song of love that was so powerful that I could feel it pulsing through my veins. My favorite story was the origin story, and that's a story I want to share with you, especially those of you who have been studying religion and wondering about the role of women in religion. This is the story where I first saw myself as someone who could become a woman warrior. This is how the story goes. It's our origin story. 550 years ago, there lived a man named Nanak in what is now India and Pakistan. And in that time, he was so distraught by the religious violence around him, Hindus and Muslims at each other's throats. He saw the tyranny of patriarchy and empty ritual, and he retreated to a river and sat in perfect contemplation, waiting for the answer. The sun rose and the sun fell, and the sun rose and the sun fell. And the third day, the sun rose, and people thought he was a dead man. People thought he was a drowned man. But as Nanak sat in perfect contemplation, in that moment, he was struck with this vision, this revelation of our oneness. Ik Onkar, the oneness of humanity, the oneness of the world. We belong to one another. Nanak was struck in a state of vismat, ecstatic wonder, and the state of wonderment at our oneness threw him into a song of love that he kept singing. Na ko beri nahi begana. There is no enemy. I see no enemy. I see no stranger, believed Nanak. He looked at the world through the eyes of wonder. It was as if he could look upon anyone or anything and say, "You are a part of me I do not yet know." Now, Papaji would say, but love is dangerous business. Guru Nanak says, if you wish to play the game of love with me, step forth with your head on your palm. And Papaji was saying, love is not talk, talk, talk. Love is action. Love is dangerous business. For if I see you as a part of me I do not yet know, if I see you as my sister, as my brother, then I must let your story into my heart. I must let your grief into my heart. I must be willing to fight for you when you are in harm's way. And so those who followed Nanak, there were many bhakti movements at that time, all throughout South Asia, but those who followed Nanak created their own independent religion called Sikhism or Sikhi. They called themselves Sikhs. Sikh, S-I-K-H, is to be a student of truth, a disciple of truth. They were called students, but they became warriors. Because if I see you as sister, brother, then if you are in harm's way, I must be willing to fight against injustice. So over the years, there were 10 Sikh gurus, and over the years, we gained on martial qualities. We became warriors trained to fight the oppression of empire. The ideal in the Sikh faith was the Sant Sipahi, the sage warrior. The warrior fights, the sage loves. It's a path of revolutionary love, theology and action, spirituality and social justice, not separate spheres, but fused within us as a single calling. That's what my grandfather taught me when he told me the story of the first woman warrior. In 1705, the story goes, there was a great battle against the oppression of empire, and there were 40 soldiers who were meant to show up at their post, but they were afraid of what they might see, of what they might risk, and so they returned to their village trembling. When a village woman turned to look at them and said, "You will not abandon your post. You will return to the fire, and I will lead you." Her name was Mai Pago. She donned a turban, she mounted a horse, and with fire in her eyes, she led them where no one else would. She became the one she was waiting for. My grandfather, every time I came home crying from the racial slur or the conversion attempts to Christianity, how many friends and neighbors and teachers told me that I would go to hell if I didn't say the words to make me Christian. And so my grandfather would look at me and say, my dear, don't abandon your post. I was a little girl in 2 long braids who liked to ride tractors on my family's farm, but my grandfather saw me as a warrior. And what did that mean? That I had to refuse to hate those who would hate me. That I would have to insist on wondering about those who refuse to wonder about me. That I would have to find the strength to hold my post, to keep the love inside of my veins from fading. The love our ancestors taught us. So you see, growing up on the farm, I heard that call to love. From my grandparents and the Japanese American elders and all those and the white Christian man who stood up for us. I heard it in their stories, and I heard that call to love coursing down through the centuries, on the lips of our spiritual teachers and our indigenous healers and our social reformers who called us to that ancient call of a love without limit. It wasn't until September 11th that I understood just how dangerous it was to hold your post. I remember watching the screen, the towers fall endlessly between images of a man with a turban and beard. I was a kid in college. It must have been toward the end of Pat's life. When her story was ending, mine was just beginning. Because as I looked at that screen, I realized that our nation's new enemy looked like my family. And within hours, we heard stories of hate violence breaking out on city streets all across America against Muslim Americans and against my community, against Sikh Americans. You see, we keep our hair long uncut hair to represent our commitment to love all of humanity, Sarbat Bala, and men and many women wrap their hair in turbans. And how ironic then that these turbans meant to represent our commitment to love and serve and fight for justice marked us as terrorists in this country, as targets for hate. And I remember this was before social media, before YouTube, and I would just open my email and see my sister's been chased, my brother's been beaten, my uncle's been stabbed, our Gurdwara's on fire. Someone's going to die, someone's going to die, someone's going to die. And then on September 15th, I got the phone call from Arizona. Bob, your uncle had been killed. Balbir Singh Sodhi was a Sikh father who was a deeply kind man. He had come to America to escape the pogroms against Sikhs in 1984. He chose this country because he believed he could wear his turban without fear and raise his family, keep his family safe. And so he drove cabs and worked the register at the 7-Eleven and sent money home to India. And when he opened his gas station in Mesa, Arizona, he was so proud. He stood before the gas station, and when children came, he would give them candy and treat them as the children of his own children, these children of his customers. When people had no money to fill up on gas, he would just let them fill up and go. And his brothers would look at him and say, "Are you a saint or are you a fool?" And he would say, "God wants us to serve all." Anytime he passed a Christian church with his son in the car, he would bow his head in reverence, and his son would look at him and say, "Dad, what are you doing? We're not Christian." He would say, "God wants us to serve all. God lives everywhere," he would say. So this man, I don't think people of color need to be saints to be revered in death, but this man was an exceptional man. He was embodying the love of our ancestors, wasn't he? So much so that on September 15th, when he was at the checkout line in Costco, he was buying crates of flowers to plant in front of his store. He saw a jar that said 9/11 Victims Fund, and he just emptied out his wallet, everything that he could. And he was looking for a flag to fly in front of his store. And his brother said, "Don't worry, we'll see you tonight. I'll bring a flag for you." 45 minutes later, Balbir uncle was getting ready to plant these flowers in front of his gas station when a pickup truck came behind the bend and 5 shots rang out, and Balbir uncle died where he fell. His story could have ended there, as many do. But like Pat, Balbir uncle had been faithful to the labor, living every day with love as his compass. And so his story did not end there. His story was just beginning. His death was a beginning because of how he lived. You see, he had lived a life so committed to love that he had inspired his brothers to respond to his murder, not with fear or with vengeance, but with a call to love and serve all. His brothers held a press conference the next day to try to tell America his story, and hearing them inspired me, a kid in college, to try to tell that story too. And so that is how I became an activist. I took a leave of absence and I crisscrossed the nation with my camera, capturing stories of hate violence that were buried in this anthem of national unity. Our stories barely made the evening news. Our lives were not grievable, and therefore our lives did not matter. But I thought we could change that if we could tell the story, and if we could tell the story well. And so I went from city to city, from home to home, sometimes when the blood was still fresh on the ground. And as people began to yell at us to go back to our country, to go back to where we came from, I began to feel a kind of despair spread through my chest. And I had one last interview, and it was with the widow of Balbir Singh Sodhi. And so I traveled to India, where she was living, to meet her. And I had this long list of questions. And as I made my way through the farmlands of Punjab that looked so much like the farmlands of my home, we went past these villages, and there she was standing in front of her home, and she was dressed in the color of white, the color of mourning. And I just threw away my questions, and I sat with her and I wept with her, and I asked her just one question: what would you like to tell the people of America? At this point, I was expecting reproach. I was expecting despair, but she said, "Tell them thank you. When I went to Arizona for my husband's funeral, They came out in the thousands. Hindu, Christian, Muslim, they didn't know me, but they wept with me. They cared for me. They loved me. Tell them thank you for their love. That moment saved me. It still saves me. Because I began to understand, well, the nation did not know Bulbir Uncle's story. The local community had told the story well, that he would not live to see the eyes of his grandchildren, that his widow's heart was now broken, that they told the story so well that his neighbors saw him not as a foreigner or a suspect or potential terrorist. They saw him as a brother. And they showed up to grieve with this widow. Every time people who have no obvious reason to love one another come together to grieve, they give rise to new relationships, even movements. You see, that single act of love, it did not stop the hate, but it did make it possible for this family, this community to go on. And that's what we saw over and over again in story after story, that one act of revolutionary love inspires another. So that just a few years ago, Rana Sodhi, the younger brother of Bulbir Sodhi, reached out to his brother's murderer to forgive him. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Frank Roque, the man who killed Bulbir Singh Sodhi, said, yes, I'm sorry for what happened to your uncle, but I'm also sorry for the thousands who were killed on 9/11. You refused to take responsibility. This is a man who said, we need to go out and kill those towelheads and their children too. But Rana, as I was becoming angry on the phone, Rana kept wondering, kept listening to Frank. He could hear what I could not hear. He said, Frank, this is the first time I've heard you say you were sorry. And Frank said, yes, I am sorry for what I did to your brother. And when I go to heaven to be judged by God, I will ask to see your brother, and I will hug him, and I will ask for his forgiveness. And Rana said, we've already forgiven you. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is freedom from hate. Because when we are free from hate, we are able to see the truth. That there are no such thing as monsters in this world. There are only human beings who are wounded, who act out of their insecurity or blindness or greed or complicity. That does not make them any less dangerous. But when we see their humanity, when we see their wound, it frees us. In all my years, in the last 20 years, I've worked inside of supermax prisons. I've worked at the shores of Guantanamo. I've worked in poor neighborhoods. I've worked at the site of mass shootings. And every time I sit down with the police officer or the prison guard or the white supremacist and I want to hate them, I get quiet. And I ask why, and I listen. And when I listen to their story, I see their humanity. And when I see their humanity, I see their wound. That makes me a smarter activist. You see, loving one's opponents is not just a moral act, it is a strategic one. It is a practical one. Every time I have unseated bad actors, and I have put police officers behind bars as part of campaigns against police brutality, and we have unseated mayors from office, but every time we only focused on bad actors, we did not change very much. But when we went after systems, when we went after institutions, that is when we saw transformation. And so with all of these stories, these acts of revolutionary love for others, for our opponents, for ourselves over the years, I came to have a picture of how we achieve social change. Before I talk to you about the how, I want to spend a moment to say why. Why I believe revolutionary love, these acts of revolutionary love, are the call of our times. This is what I know to be true. Everything that we have survived in the last few years, from the immense disparities during this pandemic to the racial reckonings, to the wildfires that could have been stopped if we ended climate change, to the images of Haitian refugees at the border. You name these the rise of white supremacist movements here in the United States, across Europe, around the globe. And you see that this is an unprecedented time in history. I call it an era of transition, for in the United States, we are in the midst of a massive demographic transition. Within 25 years, the number of people of color on the soil will exceed the number of white people for the first time since colonization. So we are at a crossroads. Will we? Will we continue to descend into a kind of civil war? A power struggle with those who wish to return America to a past where only a certain class of white people hold dominion? Or will we birth a nation that has never been? A nation made up of other nations. A nation that is truly multi-faith, multiracial, multicultural. A nation where, as Pat believed, there is dignity for all of us. The stakes become existential when we think of climate change. For as the storms are raging, the fires are raging in California, threatening the sequoias I love so much, we are seeing all that we are losing, all that we are about to lose. We wonder, are we on the brink of mass suffering and extinction? Or will we begin to marshal the vision and the skill and the solidarity to solve this problem together, to deliver a sustainable future? Humanity itself is in transition. We need our ancestors now. We need our ancestors now because the future is dark. Is this the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a nation still waiting to be born? What if our world is not on the brink of ending, but what if we are about to birth a nation, a world that is sustainable for generations? A healthy, multiracial, multi-faith world where you see my child as yours. Is this the darkness of the tomb, or is this the darkness of the womb? And I have to tell you the truth. It is both. There are days so deadly, I feel like I can taste the ash in my mouth. I mean, having labored for justice for 20 years, when I became a new mother, my son was born at the onset of the 2016 election season when hate crimes were skyrocketing, and now I braid his long hair and I tie it in a juda, and I know that he will wear his hair in a turban as part of his faith one day, and I send him off to school knowing that I cannot protect him from the racial slurs. My first racial slur was 6 years old. His was 4. He was 4 years old when he was sitting on the shoulders of my father coming home from a concert in the park when he heard the words, "Go back to your country." I know, like so many mothers before me, that I cannot protect my son, my children from white supremacist violence. I can only make them strong enough to face it. And when I think of the last 20 years and how with every film, with every lawsuit, with every campaign, I thought we were making the nation safer for the next generation. And now my son, my children are growing up in a nation more dangerous for them than it was for me or for my grandfather who arrived a century ago. I think, what is progress? But when I sit at the feet of Black women and Indigenous women, and I hear their stories, I realize that if we take colonization and slavery as the true starting point for the history of the Americas, then what my people have survived the last 20 years or the last century is not an aberration. It is a continuation of what people of color have long had to fight on this soil. And that's why I was so moved to learn how Pat Reif made sure that studying feminist spirituality meant lifting up and centering the voices of women of color who know in their being and their breath how not to leave anyone behind. Is this the darkness of the tomb, or the darkness of the womb. Yes, some days I taste that ash in my mouth, and on other days I see glimpses of the world longing to be born. I see it on nights like this, when you all have gathered. I mean, look at us, we're talking through screens, the audacity of us daring to gather, to continue to gather when a pandemic keeps us apart. Those of us from different races, faiths, backgrounds, congregating around this question of how to love with Pat Reif's memory in our hearts. I mean, this too is a pocket of revolutionary love. This too is an act of solidarity, to think together and to choose to act together. And I see images. Don't you see these images we've never seen before? In the wake of George Floyd's murder, it felt like 1992 in LA. It felt like 1968. But then I saw these images of white people standing in front of Black people, kneeling in the street in front of army, of police officers. And I thought, we haven't seen these images before. Pat would be proud, because now we are seeing multiracial, multi-faith uprisings for Black lives. Just like what I saw from my community after the massacre in Indianapolis in April of this year, a massacre on Sikhs, felt like Oak Creek, Wisconsin. The massacre on us in 2012, it felt like post 9/11. And yet when I called for a solidarity vigil, there were 10,000 people of all faiths and races, movement leaders saying, we are one in the struggle for a more just and beautiful world, and you are not alone. Shallow solidarity is based on the logic of exchange. I show up for you, so you show up for me. But deep solidarity is rooted in the recognition that we belong to one another. Deep solidarity is rooted in love. And that kind of solidarity is what helps us last. It helps us find longevity and the long labor for justice. And so, if we think of progress as linear, then we are sliding backwards into the darkness, aren't we? But if we think of America as one long labor, the story of America as one long labor, if we think of America as a nation still waiting to be born, then progress and birthing labor is cyclical, not linear. It's cyclical, a series of expansions and contractions. And so, yes, it feels like the previous traumas, doesn't it? It feels like nothing has changed. And yet every turn through the cycle, if we show up with love, a kind of revolutionary love, if more and more of us show up alongside Pat Reif and all of these ancestors who've given before us, if more and more of us are awake to the fact that we belong to one another, if more and more of us turn our theology into action, then we are creating more and more space for dignity and equality than there was before. Just like in birthing labor, a little bit more space. Here's the thing, I don't know how many more turns through the cycle it's going to take before we birth in America where we are all safe and free, but I want to show up to do my part in the labor when my turn comes. And the way that I have found longevity in that labor for justice and efficacy is through what I call practice of revolutionary love. And so now, this brings me to you, and this brings me to the how. Because I see so many of you, sisters who are part of this community of the Immaculate Heart. I see you as students who are studying these texts. I see you as professors who are on the front lines teaching your students. I see all of you as midwives to this world in transition. How will you show up? How would you lead with love in your classrooms, in your streets, in your families, in your communities? The how is what I want to give you now. We're going to begin with definitions. Okay, these definitions are important because, as a lawyer, I told you all these stories about revolutionary love, right? Through my history, through my family, through my faith. And yet, when I was trained as a lawyer, anytime somebody stood up on a stage and said love was the answer, I would roll my eyes. Love in the face of all of this? But I've come to understand that the problem is not with love. The problem is the way we talk about it in our culture. So this is why definitions are important. Love is more than a rush of feeling. Love is sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, life-giving, a choice we make again and again. And if love is labor, then love contains all of our emotions. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Rage, the opposite of love is not rage. Rage is the force that protects that which we love. And so what does it mean to think of a way to do nonviolent action that takes into account our grief and our rage and our joy? This is my version, my offering to feminist spirituality that Pat Reif and so many others breathed into existence. This is my feminist intervention, is to say that love is labor, and revolutionary love is the choice to enter into labor for others, for our opponents, and for ourselves. I took time away from the front lines after my children were born for them, for myself. I had to figure out this question of how do we breathe and push? How do we stay in the labor? And so I poured through all the stories of my life and all the texts from divinity school to law school. I poured through case studies, and I brought researchers together from neuroscience and ethics and history and psychology. I built a framework that many are calling the new nonviolence. And it identifies these 10 core practices, which I imagine as points on a compass. So this is the tool that I wish to put into your hands now. And Janice will show you the compass so that I can talk you through it. And you're going to be tempted to take a lot of notes, but the good news is all of this is available for free. I now lead the Revolutionary Love Project. And if you go to seenostranger.com and click on the Learning Hub link on the corner, you'll see teaching videos and educational curricula for high schools and colleges and faith leaders. You'll see guided inquiries, you'll see music, and you'll see artwork, and you'll see that it's all bringing this compass to life. So I'm going to talk you through this compass. Just let it wash over you and see what resonates with you, and then we'll open into a Q&A so we can really talk about it. So you ready? I'm going to do this kind of like a whirlwind. But again, you can dig in deep when you go to our Learning Hub. All right. So revolutionary love is the choice to labor for others, opponents, and ourselves. You can take this compass in your hand and you can point it to who you want to practice loving. So let's turn the compass toward an other. So anyone who is not you is an other. And this practice I call See No Stranger. It begins with that practice on the inner ring, wonder. To look upon the face of anyone and say, you are a part of me I do not yet know, is a conscious act. It is a cognitive act. We know from studies in implicit bias, we know from brain imaging studies and neuroscience that when we look upon the face of another, when we're walking on the street or in the subway or on the street, that our minds decide in a split second whether they belong to our in-group or out-group. So if our minds are primed to see the world in terms of us and them, then we know that racial stereotypes on this soil, structured by white supremacy, determines who we see as part of us. So if we all carry implicit bias within us, how can we retrain our eye to see no stranger? It takes conscious practice. And so one practice that my children and I do when we walk down the street, we look up on the faces of people passing by and say, sister, brother, sibling, grandfather, beloved. And when we are doing that, we are training our eye to see them as part of us, to see them as kin. Now, this sounds really simple, but it is revolutionary stuff, because who you see as one of us determines who you stand up for, what policies you support, what leaders you elect, how you choose to build community. Because what happens when we see George Floyd as brother, or Breonna as sister, or migrant child at the border as our own beloved child, what would you risk? What would you do differently? What would Pat have you do? Wonder. Wonder is that primary act of loving another. Empathy, to feel as another. Compassion, to feel for another. Those are feelings that come and go. They're tools you can pick up. But the key is to begin and return to wonder. This leads me to the second practice. When you wonder about another, you inevitably let their grief into your heart. And that can be hard. When you see that grief coming, you will want to throw up the flag and sound the bells, but you have to keep your heart porous in order to love well. You see, grieving is an act of surrender. Here's the thing, in our culture, we think that we need to fix grief. We think we need to say the right words, but there is no fixing it. There's only bearing it. There are no right words. There's only witness. And I'm naming this as an act of revolutionary love because it's often pushed to the margins of our movements. Grieving together gives you information for how to fight for one another. And it allows those you're building relationships with to let those relationships be rooted in weeping together, which is what gives rise to that deep solidarity I was talking about. So grieving leads then to knowing how to fight. So I come from a warrior people. So I use warrior metaphors, swords and shields. You take them only if they're useful to you. I believe all of us has a sword. All of us has a shield. Mine is my law degree, my film camera. What is yours? All of us has a specific area of influence, a specific arena where we are needed. Wondering, grieving, fighting. These are the practices that create a strong movement. It's how we practice seeing no stranger. And, you know, I developed this for what I was doing out in the world, but very soon I was practicing with my own kids. I have to wonder about my kids every day in order to figure out how to care for them. I often have to grieve with them what the world tells them no, and then I have to fight to keep them safe in the face of pandemic and racism on the street. And so wondering, grieving, fighting is also how we can build really close, intimate relationships in our own lives. All right. So that's how we see no stranger. Then you take this compass. Now this is where it gets hard, right? Take this compass. And what if you have an opponent in front of you? Now note, I do not use the word enemy. An enemy is a fixed and permanent position. An opponent is a fluid category. People can come in and out, and an opponent is anyone whose ideas, beliefs, or actions oppose yours. You will always have opponents in your life. The question is, how will you orient to them? And this is the practice of how to embody the love ethic when it comes to opponents. Tend the wound. Tend the wound. Remember, there are no such thing as monsters in this world. There are only human beings who are wounded. To see the wound is to see their humanity. Now, notice that this practice of tending the wound, look at that inner practice again. It begins with tending our own wound. It begins with honoring our rage. Now, I used to think that the opposite of love was rage, but the opposite of love is not rage. It is it is indifference. Rage is what the force that helps us protect that which we love. The solution is not to suppress our rage, as so many of us have been taught, or to let it explode. The solution is to be able to process our rage in safe containers like our ancestors did. The wailing and the shaking and the dancing and the drumming and the singing, let those be safe containers for your rage. And then when you can take a breath, you can ask yourself, what information does this rage carry? And how do I want to harness this energy for the action that I take in the world? I call that harnessed energy divine rage. Some say, are uncomfortable with rage in our spiritual traditions. I say we have to look closer. Think of the rage in the eyes of Jesus as he overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. Think of the rage in the eyes of the woman warrior as she mounted horse and went into battle. That is what I call divine rage. The aim of divine rage is not vengeance. The aim of divine rage is to reorder the world. Now, only for those who are safe enough or brave enough can enter the next practice, which is to listen. Listening to our opponents, not to change them or persuade them or legitimize them or compromise them. No, you listen to opponents in order to understand them. In the process of listening, they might want to try to understand you too. And then an exchange has taken place. Reconciliation might be possible, but even if it is not, it's okay, because the aim of listening is to understand the wound in your opponent and then take that information to that next practice, which is to reimagine. It's not just about resistance. I was so proud. I think I had t-shirts called the resistance. Remember that? We have to resist in order to protect our survival. But if we're only resisting, we're not changing the power structures. We have to reimagine the new. I think that's what Pat did when she created her own community, a separate space that reimagined what beloved community could be. Can you reimagine the institutions, the contexts, the cultures that allow our opponents to continue to hurt us? That is the challenge now. Can you imagine a vision of the future that leaves no one behind? Not even them. Raging, listening, reimagining. These are the practices that I call upon when I'm tending to opponents. And of course, I use them with my kids too. When my son is throwing a tantrum, I used to be so ashamed of my rage until I realized I just needed to process it. Ask, what information does it carry? To listen to him. Maybe we change the stack time to reimagine the culture of our home. So raging, listening, reimagining, to step away to rage, to return to listen, to reimagine solutions together becomes a kind of dance. One more thing before we move on from opponents. Everyone has a different role in the labor of revolutionary love at any given time. If you are someone who has a knee on your neck, it is not your role to look up at your opponent and try to wonder about them or love them. No, my love, your role is to stay alive, to take the next breath. That is your revolutionary act. But if you are in a position to be safe enough or brave enough to tend to those kinds of opponents, we need you now. We need you now. So much of this work is about deciding what is my role to play at any particular time. Now, our social reformers through history, Gandhi, King, Mandela, they taught us so much about how to love others, how to love our opponents. They did not teach us at length about how to love ourselves. This is the feminist intervention. This is the Black women leaders I've learned from, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, who teach us that caring for ourselves is not self-indulgence, but a form of political warfare. This is where I go to, I use these warrior metaphors because I come from a warrior people. I also use birthing metaphors because I come from women who have pushed through the fire, through unspeakable circumstances. And here is where the wisdom of the midwife is useful for all of us in all of our various labors. There's a kind of wisdom to how to sustain stamina in any long labor. She doesn't say push, 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 my love. No, she says breathe, my love, and then push, and then breathe again. It's a cadence. It's a rhythm. So that inner practice is, how are you breathing every day? Who are you breathing with? Are you breathing with the earth, the sea, the stars, with music, with movement, with prayer? And then when you are ready, how are you pushing? Because oftentimes the work of reckoning with privilege or accountability or apology or forgiveness or reconciliation or repair, often it's uncomfortable. You think you're not doing it right because it's uncomfortable in your body, but no, my love, that's a sign that you are pushing to evolve yourself. Breathe and then push and then breathe again. And then when it's hard, that's when you know that it's transition. You are transitioning yourself as you're transitioning the world. And that's where we don't give birth alone. We don't go to battle alone. We need to call upon our midwives at our side and our ancestors at our back to tell us, to remind us, you are brave. You are brave as they are tonight. Remember the ancestor you named tonight. Can you imagine them now? Pat lived a joyful life. How did she live a joyful life? I believe it's because she labored with love. Because when we labor with love, our labor becomes porous enough to let breath in. And when we let breath in, when we let singing and dancing and resting in, then we can let joy in. And that is that 10th practice. Joy returns us to everything that is good and beautiful and worth fighting for. Joy gives us that longevity in the labor. Joy makes it so that the labor is not just a means to an end, it becomes an end in itself. Thank you, Janice. You can let the slide go and I'll bring us back before we dive into the Q&A. This is what I wish to tell you, that I've spent the last 20 years of my life organizing around hate. I'm going to be spending the next 20 years organizing around love. You see, I believe that revolutions happen not just in those big, grand public moments, but in the spaces where people come together to inhabit a new way of being. I believe we need sound government and we need just policy. The only way we will deliver a world the world that we dream, is if we create a shift in culture and consciousness, is if we awaken each other to the oneness at the heart of it all, is if we invite people into a way of seeing and a way of being that leaves no one outside of our circle of care. What if we could see the way Guru Nanak saw, the way that Pat lived, the way that Babir uncle died? What if we could see no stranger? What if we could teach our children to see no stranger? What if we could give a critical mass of people in this country the tools to build beloved community where we are, to be brave with our grief, to harness our rage, to reimagine together? What if we could build anti-racist, healthy, sustainable community in every corner of this country, every school, every house of worship, every industry, every home, every heart? That is the revolution of the heart that I believe that we need in order to last as individuals and as a human race. And so I leave you with this, just as we named all those ancestors here tonight. We will be someone's ancestors one day. They will summon us. They will conjure us. They will name us. And if we show up like Pat did, like Babir uncle did, then perhaps what they will inherit from these traumatic years is not our fear, not our wounds, but our bravery and our love. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to speak with you and to reflect with you.
Valarie, thank you so much. I mean, you have really, I think, awakened revolutionary love in our minds and our hearts to a very deep degree. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is we do have a couple of questions. We have one in the chat and then a couple in the Q&A. So someone, Angelina asks, I don't know if it's a question, but maybe you can explain maybe a link to RBG about this, since you are a lawyer.
Oh, so I went to Yale Law School, and every once in a while we would see these black robes floating through the hallways and we would all get so excited because we knew the justices were visiting, and RBG was the most beloved of them. The most beloved. All of us who were women and who sought to become civil rights lawyers, we looked to her. And what was so delightful, I mean, my husband is a filmmaker, and so he was part of the crew that did an interview with RBG, and what he reported back to me, I was like, tell me everything about it. I was like, how did he get an audience and I didn't? He was just like, her humor. She made a joke about a case, a Supreme Court, a play on words about bakers and law and cakes, and came back and realized only after she left the room did everyone kind of look at each other and realize, like, they finally got the joke. And that's when it's like, oh, RBG was not only a warrior, not only a champion, she was someone who also let in joy and had a gorgeous sense of humor, and use that to show us that even though hope, I think of hope as a feeling that waxes and wanes. Sometimes it's bright and luminous in the sky, and sometimes it's just a sliver, you can barely see it, and it's okay, my love, like, let it wax and wane. What matters is the work your hands do. And what has helped me show up to the labor, even in the dark, even when I don't know, even when I feel hopeless, what helps me is when I drop into the here and now, and I let in the humor, and I let in the joy, and I dance with my children. And I remember RBG's wit, and that helps us walk in her shoes and find longevity in the labor. And that's it. I want to grow old. I want to grow old with you. I want to be an old woman like her one day and look back like Pat one day and look back and say, I was faithful to the labor.
Wonderful. I think Nicola is going to ask the next question for us.
Thank you so much, Valarie. This is just absolutely wonderful. And I'm going to pass along another question here by Greg Jan. And he asks, in this mass media culture, most media seems to want to encourage conflict, polarization, and even hate. What can be done at that level to instead shift our culture toward love?
I think of mimesis, right? That human beings imitate the stories that we see again and again and again. And I've often dreamt of a revolutionary love column in the New York Times. Like, what does it mean for us to tell more stories and inspire others? Because once we do, it helps people imagine themselves into those roles. And so what is inspiring to me is that, yes, well, we have the 24-hour news cycle and we have the same old tired narratives again and again, reifying the us versus them. We also have more channels available to us, especially as young people, than ever before, to be able to tell our own stories, to use our own platforms. Remember, I didn't have that 20 years ago. I had no way of even letting the world know that we were being beaten and killed. We spent so many years trying to get the world to know that simply we were victims. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I realized, like, oh, they don't need to, every time someone would be killed, an uncle would say, they just need to know us. They just need to know who we are. We're Sikhs, not Muslims. I'm like, well, they know Black people. They know Indigenous people. They're still getting killed. They don't need to know us. They need to love us. And how do we do that? We have to show them who we are. And so my message these days to younger Sikhs in particular is to say, yes, these stories are our inheritance, but remember, we are not victims. We are warriors. We are teachers. We are survivors. We have something to show America about how to sustain longevity in the long labor for justice, how to lead with love in the face of oppression. Can we tell those stories? And so I see more and more young people telling those stories. And I've been part of projects and documentaries and narrative films. We had a pilot at NBC for 2 years. I mean, we've been in the work of letting mainstream media, kind of infiltrating mainstream media by telling these stories around that center people of color, that lead with the wisdom that has been on the margins for too long. And so what I see is, like, it's not there yet, but the what's been on the margins, almost invisible, we're bringing it more and more and more into the mainstream. And I think in 20 years, if we can create a generation that is inspired and equipped with these stories, and perhaps that creates the generational culture shift that we are all dreaming of.
Terrific. Terrific, thank you. Now, there was just one question in the chat from White Feather and she asks, how do we create love and use the words fight and fighting?
Yeah. You know what? When I was first part of the anti-war movement, when I was in college, we were all about nonviolence. And it was, we laid out the blueprints. I was arrested in the streets. I organized again and again. And I remember really being quiet about my warrior heritage. I thought that if I used the metaphor around warrioring and fighting, that it didn't belong in the movements for nonviolence that I was part of. Until I began to understand that nonviolence was fierce and strategic and savvy and powerful and required a kind of moral fiber, a kind of fight impulse that wasn't passive or anemic at all. And so instead of being ashamed of the fight impulse inside of me, I thought, what might it mean for me as a woman to reclaim that impulse to fight? Remember, it's fight, flight, or freeze. Our impulse to fight is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to experience and honor as what it means to be fully human, like fully in our bodies. The question is, how do you fight? Do you fight out of pure reaction in such a way that delivers more death and bloodshed and inflicts more wounds? Or do you fight, you harness that fight impulse in such a way that it is like the focused fury from the forehead of the goddess? It is nonviolent strategic action. And to describe that, I found it to be useful to call upon the warrior metaphors of my faith, to ask myself, what is my sword? What is my shield? Who do I go into battle with? We don't go into battle alone, right? Who do I train with? These metaphors were useful for me in nonviolent direct action, and increasingly are useful for me when I think about how to keep my children safe, how to fight for them. Now, this is useful, I think, to bring out the revolutionary power and revolutionary love. And I completely understand if the warrior metaphors don't serve you, too much actual bloodshed, right? So just you release them. Same thing with the birthing metaphors. If they don't serve you, you just release them. You take what is useful to you. But I do want to plant a flag on the point that the fight impulse is something not to suppress, but something to allow ourselves to feel. The heart beating fast, the fist clenching, the throat raw. And then you breathe and you ask yourself, how do I want to direct this into what I do in the world? That helps me show up in the fullness of my body, of my energy, and my power. Yes, Lo. Sorry, I'm just going to answer this. Yeah, and it's like, how do we fight, right? And that gets to the question of how. Do we fight individuals or do we fight unjust systems? And this is where it's very useful for me to think about how to shift from resistance to reimagining. That all the great social reformers, they weren't just concerned about unseating bad actors. They were concerned with imagining institutions of power in which we all belonged, imagining different worlds. And that's what Pat Reif did, right? She imagined and breathed into being an alternative way of being together. Instead of just resisting, she recreated, right? So what does it mean for us to be able to make space for both as a way to direct the fight impulse? And I think that is the question that we have right now, that some institutions must be reformed. Some institutions must be dismantled. Some institutions must be replaced and reimagined altogether. And so part of the work around fighting the good fight is asking ourselves, what is needed now and what is my role in it?
The next question for you, Valarie, is from Jackie and Fred here. Jackie says, I was a member of the Immaculate Heart community, and I knew and studied philosophy under Pat Reif. At 78 years old, my husband and I don't have decades ahead, but what can individuals do to give birth, as you describe it, to revolutionary love, not just in our immediate surroundings, but in the larger community?
We need you. We need your memory. We need your mentorship. We need your witness. We need you. We need you in relationship with us, with younger people. I remember after the 2016 election, I called a man who has come to be a godfather figure in my life, Parker Palmer. And I was weeping on the phone. I said, I failed, we failed, as if it was on my shoulders. It was like, we failed. I was so worried about the safety of my children, my family, my community. And I thought, what was it all for? All the activism of the last generation, if not to prevent this. And Parker, right? Elder, like 80 years old elder, says to me, don't measure your life based on outcomes. That's such a very narrow way to measure your worth. Measure your life based on your faithfulness to the labor. Are you faithful to your values? Are you faithful to the labor of love? Are you showing up with love? If you measure by that metric, my love, you're doing well. That's all you need to do. You care about outcomes, yes, but that deep sense of worth that helps you stay in or give up, you solidify that worth by knowing that showing up as you are, as who you are, is enough. I needed that. And if a sister told me, or a brother, or even a parent, I'd be like, yeah, you're just trying to make me feel better. But an elder told me, an elder who had lived through the civil rights movement, if you are in relationship with younger people, who are trying to fight the good fight, who are in the streets or in the classroom or in the hospitals, working on the front lines. If you're in relationship with any of us, and you can be there to catch us and mentor us and give us your stories, give us your memories, give us your witness, that is your revolutionary role. That is what gives us the wisdom and the energy to go on. And when it's safe enough for you to join us in those moments in the streets or in the vigils or behind closed doors when we need you in those encounters, then join us. But there's a role that you play that is so valuable, so essential that no one else can play. And Parker wrote this book On the Brink of Everything that's really explaining the role of intergenerational friendship and mentorship. And he always says, like, I mentor him in return, but so apparently you all get something out of it too. But I invite you to invest in those relationships now, because again, that's even if you don't have decades left, that is exactly how your light won't ever stop shining. It lives on through us. The song you sing is now what sings through our lungs too. So that's your immortality. And so you do it for now, do it for the present, and do it for the future.
Wonderful. Okay, so Ethel Tink asks, there seems to be so much anger posted on social media platforms, I mean, especially in the news today, and yet I do see the opportunity to connect and share love on such threads filled with hate language and angst. Do you see these platforms as an opportunity, even for some of us who are elders, often sitting in our homes?
Ooh, okay, well, that's God's work. I suggest not doing this alone. I suggest doing this as part of groups. And I remember that, my husband was part of a group at one point. There are different groups, especially during election seasons, that are saying we're going to be on those platforms to check misinformation, to check hate language. And you need to be supported if you're doing that. Because if that kind of energy, it's very toxic, it's very difficult to hold in your body. And we're all just bodies showing up to do this work. And so if you're going to do that work on social platforms, I say, don't do it alone. Do it as part of a group that is supporting each other, that is giving you templates for how to respond, that is, giving you some infrastructure so that you're not alone in that work. That is one way. I also believe that being part of alternative communities that are leading with love and growing those spaces and inviting more and more people into those spaces is probably even more beneficial. It's just to create the alternative. And I'll finally say this, that, that alone, of course, is not going to solve the problem of all the hate and misinformation that we see all online. Before I started the Revolutionary Love Project, I was part of the movement for digital freedom, working at Stanford Law School. And we see the policies that we need. We see the big institutional structural changes we need to fix the algorithms and hold social media platforms accountable and speak truth to power in the face of companies who are amassing power unchecked. And so we have those policy proposals. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach to be able to shift culture online. One is the one-on-one that some of us can engage in, but the other, in order to really change the media culture on social media, is to be able to put some of these policies and practices into place. So one thing you could do is support some of those initiatives. Color of Change is a great organization with some of those policy proposals. Another is to be part of a group that is doing some of that cleaning online.
My turn to pass along the question for you. This is an anonymous attendee who has asked, do you think racism has been getting worse over time? And how do you think leaders can make a difference in racism?
I don't think it's getting worse. I think it's getting uncovered. And it's getting uncovered in such a way that is forcing a lot of people who did not want to see it and to reckon with it. And that is hard. And some are responding by retreating into fear and clinging onto an old notion, a narrative of what America has been. And others are finding the courage to sit and process white privilege and work through shame and discover how to be an ally and how to be an accomplice. And so I see both happening. It's just because it's becoming uncovered, it's becoming even more polarized. And so as it's becoming more polarized, how can we create more avenues, more invitations in for those who are retreating or those who are in between to say, no, 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 my love, there's a place for you here. You don't have to feel ashamed that the story you've been telling yourself about America, a city on a hill, as land of home and free, that story is false. It's okay to let yourself grieve that story. And when I've sat with white supremacists, former white supremacists too, every time I sit and I hear their story and I see their wound, I understand that so much of white nationalist aggression is a symptom of unresolved grief. They're grieving the notion that this nation ever belonged just to them in the first place, and that's hard to take. Someone has to help them with that grief, even if it's not legitimate. Tend the wound, process it to see that there is a place for them on the other side. It probably is not someone like me, but it might be you. And so in this time, when I think it's just, we're in this reckoning, this question about what is my role to play, revolutionary love, others, opponents, ourselves. Am I someone who needs to tend to my people who are hurting and to my own body? Do I need to sit with processing our own grief and trauma and rage? Do we need to heal? Do we need to be breathing? Is that my work as caregiver, right? Some of you might say, no, I think I'm ready. I'm ready to sit with those opponents. I'm ready to reach out to the relatives, to the neighbors, to the colleagues, to some of my students, to sit and listen and engage in a sustained dialogue, a sustained relationships. Because if Hannah Arendt says isolation is the precondition for radicalization, right? If you're not talking to them, who is? Those social media platforms and the algorithms that are showing them the narratives that radicalize them further. And so can you be one of those who reaches out in relationship to those who we would see as opponents who are tempted by those narratives? Can that be a process that you invite? That's a long labor, right? So what is the support you have to tend to those opponents? And others of you still might say, my season right now, the role I have to play is to stand in solidarity with others. They're not my people, but these people. I need to be protecting those who are in harm's way. We need so many frontliners right now, so many different groups who are vulnerable right now who need you. So a lot of this, the compass, right, is about asking, okay, what is my role at any given time? Others, opponents, ourselves, sometimes within a day, sometimes within a season of your life. What is it? What is mine to take on? What is mine to do? And yes, now is the time because of this era of transition we're in.
Great. Okay, 2 more questions. I love the idea of opponents as opposed to enemies, so I just have to throw that in there. This is from Laurice Rise Diamond. I appreciate your suggestion that we seek to understand our opposers or oppositional views. How do you propose I convince I think she means oppressor, that I care about their perspective enough for them to share with me? Sometimes I think folks just want to be heard.
Yeah. Here's what I've discovered, that human beings mirror each other. If you sit down at a conversation, an encounter, and you are just daggers out, right? With judgment, even if it's the question is benign, but it's the tone is like, with judgment, how could you believe, And I hear that voice. That's my first response. Oftentimes it's like, how could you even, right? But if you lead with that, then you are failing to lead with wonder. Remember, wonder is that primary act. And oftentimes it's very easy to wonder about someone who is close to you, someone, my daughter, right? To wonder about her. It's an emotional experience, the cognitive experience. But when you're sitting with an opponent, when you feel nothing for them, it's not an emotional experience at all. And that's okay. It can be a cognitive one. It can be a choice. Why? Ask yourself, why? Like, you really want to know why? What story do they need to cling to? Why that story? If you really want to know, if you're leading with wonder, that human beings mirror each other. So if your daggers are out, their daggers will be out in defense. They will be shut down. But if you are leading with wonder, first they might be disarmed, right? That's the first, like, do they really want to know? But then they might try to answer you and try to tell you their story. And if they continue to do that, if they're heard, if they feel heard by you, if they feel seen by you, then just maybe they'll start to wonder about you too, what you believe and why you believe that. And once that happens, that's the magic of a real exchange, you know, and a process of reconciliation that takes time, many conversations, not just one. But it really begins with that earnest approach of wondering. And if that opponent never wonders about you, and it's okay, because your goal is to understand them and to bring that information back to those of us who can't have those conversations and say, oh, that's why. All right, those are the radio programs they're listening to, and those are those putting guns in their hands, and that's why that story makes sense to them. Okay, how can we tell better stories? You know, so you can decide which opponents you are ready to speak to at any given time. Sometimes there are some opponents I'm just not ready for, and others I realize I am ready for it. Your body will tell you. If you think of an opponent, your body's activated, your throat is tight, your heart's beating fast, it's probably information that it's time to love on yourself right now. Time to process your rage, your grief, trauma, stay there. If you get to a point where you could imagine that opponent and you feel a little bit, but there's a spaciousness that you can wonder about them, that might be information that it is your time to engage in the practice of listening. All of these practices, by the way, the wonder, the grieving, the fighting, all of them are on our learning hub, and it's seenostranger.com, and it's a free learning hub. We just came out with it. So we are really excited for you all to take these tools into your homes, into your congregations, into your classrooms. Then tell us what works. You know, there's meditations, there's guided inquiries, there's home practices, curricula, lesson plans. So if you check it out and then tell us what works, that will help us support you more and more in this work.
All right. It is getting late. We are cutting off questions here. We have two last ones for you. I will do one, and Janice will ask the last question. So we know it's nearly midnight where you are. So it's late for us here, but very late for you. So the second last question is from Mary Kay Monroe. Hi, Mary Kay. What advice do you have for a teacher of high school students who are frustrated, scared, and recovering from isolation, or still in isolation and don't see positive changes?
Oh, my love. Breathe. Rest. You have carried such a heavy burden for so long. I mean, just teaching in a classroom the last 4 or 5 years has been so challenging. And then teaching during a pandemic on top of that, when your students are trying to make sense of the streets on fire, literally, figuratively, I mean, their own isolation. I mean, you have been carrying so much trauma in your body, your students and your own. And so this invitation to remember the wisdom of the midwife, you know, to breathe before you push. How are you breathing? Number one, how are you breathing? Are you resting? Are you taking time for your body, for your spirit, for your own mind? Who are you breathing with? You know, are you getting, it's not, self-care is an illusion, right? And we're in harm's way. We need community care. We need others around us who are giving us the ability to breathe, to care on ourselves, to love on ourselves well. So, and we need institutions that support that too, right? So how are your schools providing a way for you all to process, to heal, to get through it? That's what I want to say first, just a witness to how hard it is. The second thing I want to say is that once you're like, okay, I'm not seeing positive change. So how do I fight helplessness or hopelessness? Remember what I said about hope is a feeling that waxes and wanes. It's okay if you don't see change. Sometimes if it's so dark, you don't see the hope. You don't see the impact. It's okay, because remember Parker Palmer, what matters is your faithfulness to the labor. Can you stay faithful to the labor? That's all you need. You might, some decades from now, a student might come and you realize this, your story, and you realize it all makes sense. It'll make sense in retrospect, but right now we need you simply to stay faithful to the labor. And how do you do that? You remember that you're not alone. You are not alone. There are thousands of educators out there who are on the front lines with you, who are wanting to make your classrooms not just as places to teach skills for professions, but as places that teach students how to love well, how to approach others, how to approach opponents, how to approach themselves with love. I'm seeing educators who are taking our revolutionary love curriculum, for example, and into their classrooms to make revolutionary love the ethic of their school culture. I'm seeing heads of school gather and create workshops and small group discussions for their faculty on how they can bring those practices in for their own lives and their own relationships between themselves as staff. I'm seeing educators take our lesson plans and run with them and integrate them into your existing curricula. So you're not alone. And if you can have any sense of community or actual support from us as the Revolutionary Love Project, again, everything is available there for you for free at that Learning Hub. So you download it, you tell us what's useful to you, tell us what you need, and then breathe again before you push.
Okay, the very, very last question, because we do have to go. This is from another Monroe, but Monroe, not Monroe. Christine, as a member of the current Immaculate Heart community, very much in transition, what do you see as the most important role of a spiritual community today?
All right. I see two great moments of transition in human consciousness and human history. The first started around 800 BC, what Karen Armstrong, religious historian, calls the axial age, where spiritual teachers all around the globe began to awaken human beings to the fact of our shared humanity. So to move us from a tribal understanding, only those who are in my tribe are fully human, to an understanding of our shared humanity, to see no stranger. For thousands of years, we've heard in our stories, our songs, our scriptures, this call to love without limit. So you and your community, the stories you have, the scriptures you have, songs you have, you've heard that call from Jesus on down to love without limit, right? Just as I have heard it from Guru Nanak, to love without limit. And all of our wisdom traditions. Abraham called us to open our tent to all, Jesus to love thy neighbor, Muhammad to take in the orphan, Buddha unending compassion, Mirabai love without limit. And so I believe that now we are in a second great transition. Will we put the ethic of that love without limit into practice? Will we embody it? Will we structure our society on the affirmation of dignity for all? Will we evolve human consciousness, or will we perish? So when you ask me, what is the role of a spiritual home now? Do you see how I see you as the midwives to a humanity in transition? To this leap of human consciousness, leap of human evolution that we have to take if we're going to survive? That's how I see you. That's how I see us. So to believe in our convictions, to believe that we have the agency and we have the power to, and we don't have to, right, take it all on. We only have to be responsible for our particular area of influence, our specific sphere. So if you in your spiritual home could equip each other to name what is yours to take on, what is yours to transition, even as you're transitioning yourself as Immaculate Heart, then that is the work. That is the work. And that will take, you know, we have the next 20, 25 years. We have the next 20, 25 years for the climate crisis, for the racial demographics in the country. That's how long we have. That's what will determine whether we last or not. So to ignite the spiritual homes of our era with a sense of urgency, a sense of agency, a sense that this is our role to play. And all are welcome. Even those with no spiritual home are welcome into this labor, because whatever inspires you, whether it's faith leaders or if you're a humanist, the love for humanity itself, whatever inspires you, we all can show up to do the labor together. We all can drink from this wellspring of love together. We can all sing the song as Pat sang together. So now's the time to sing louder or more boldly than we ever have before, and to invite others to sing along too.
Valarie, thank you so much for this. It has been absolutely mind-blowing for sure. And thank you for that. And so we have to conclude, because we want to try to stay on time because it's getting late on the East Coast. And I just want to put up the slide that shows Valarie's book, and we'll play the last song as everybody exits. And I just want to thank all of the committee, the Dean of CGU, the President of MSMU, our tech experts, Sunny and Michael, Deja, our administration person, and everyone at the IHC community. And we just want to thank you so much, and thank everyone who helped put this together, because it took a whole community.
Thank you. And can I show you a secret about the book for 30 seconds before you go?
Sure.
Okay. It's kind of cool. So here's the book. This is the paperback. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's in your bookstores. And it's the first, talk about living into the future. It's the first book that uses augmented reality to bring the author to life. So this is just my phone, and I'm just going to hover it in front of the book. Are you ready? Okay.
Revolutionary love is the call of our times. Revolutionary love is when we are brave enough to see no stranger, to look at anyone and think, you are a part of me I do not yet know. So when we flood the streets in our grief and our rage and fight for justice and insist on the humanity of our opponents, we are birthing the world to come, a world that leaves no one behind.
My 2-year-old now, she thinks all the portraits speak. She's like, look, mommy talking, what else could
It's wonderful. It worked. Thank you so much. It's the best advertisement. We don't even need the slide.
Thank you, everybody. It's such a joy to be with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Valarie. This was wonderful.